Oh. About to hear some marijuana lecture, so higher education. Here's your higher education. It says scent free in the lecture hall. Higher education. Higher education.
Zach, great pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, Zach. There. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back in Winnipeg. Hi, Jackson. How's that? Yeah, I know it's great to be back here. I was did part of my education at U of M, so it's really exciting to be able to come back here and present some of my research. So, my research is focused primarily on cannabis. I also do research on therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs. A quick disclosure before we start. My research has been funded in part by Tilray, who are a licensed producer of medical cannabis. I don't receive personal funding from them, but they fund the trial and support some of my students. It's also been funded by CHR, SHRC, the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention, and MyTax, among others. So thanks to all those funders. So today I want to talk about the use of cannabis for therapeutic purposes. Why are people using it? What are some alternatives? What are the consequences for society more broadly and mental health in particular? As a clinical psychologist, those are my primary areas of interest. And maybe talk a little bit about what's next for cannabis research. It's an interesting time for cannabis research in Canada. With recent events in the US, seems to be going in two different directions. We have an administration that's unfriendly to cannabis, and at the same time there's over 100 million people in the US that are going to be living in states where recreational cannabis is allowed. So what that means is that there can't be, or very little research done in the US because they need to do it at the federal level and there's no allowance for that. At the same time, there's going to be a growing demand for that research, and it positions Canada to be a world leader in cannabis research. So it's an exciting time to be a cannabis researcher in Canada as we move towards the end of Prohibition. So, as with any medication, when we think about the use of cannabis, we don't want to weigh the risks and benefits. The first thing we have to do there is look at the risks. And when we think about the risks, at least from a toxicology perspective, cannabis is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. That's not my conclusion. In the late 80s, an organization called NORML challenged the DEA classification. The DEA urges us to get smart about drugs. That's the Drug Enforcement Agency of the U.S. So we're gonna follow their directive today. And in '88, the DEA administrative judge described cannabis as the safest therapeutically active substance known, and the research that's been conducted, there's been a bunch since then, and it supports that conclusion. So to start off with, I want to talk about a couple studies from our group that look at who's using cannabis for therapeutic purposes and why. These are the largest studies to date of medical cannabis users in Canada, and these are funded by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention out of UBC. And what we found was that in this case, people were allowed to report several reasons for using cannabis. The most prominent was sleep, followed closely by pain and anxiety. And these are very prominent conditions that have adverse effects on the human condition. These are some of the most conditions for which we are most likely to use medications across Canada. So these are not obscure conditions. And we want to ask, when we look at risks and benefits, what are people using now for these conditions? The most prominent thing that people use for anxiety and sleep are benzodiazepines. And benzodiazepines, while they can be effective in the short term and have a number of very good applications, also have some pretty serious side effects that you wouldn't see with cannabis, including increased risk of Alzheimer's, all causes dementia, as well as a pretty pronounced dependency that can develop even after a few months. So when we look at the risks and benefits of benzos compared to cannabis, we see that I think in many aspects cannabis has a very acceptable side effect profile. When we talk about pain, which is the other prominent condition for which people are using cannabis, we have to look at some options there. And most people for pain will use non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug like aspirin, ibuprofen, Tylenol, acetaminophen. And those medications, even though they're widely used and considered to be generally harmless, are associated with significant mortality. Hundreds of people in Canada and thousands in the U.S. And across the world will die from gastrointestinal bleeding due to excessive use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories across the lifespan. And increasingly, as we see the recreational or excessive use of opioid medications, a lot of those are mixed with non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So we see increased mortality that way as well. So those are not, even though they're widely used, are not harmless. Of course, a lot of attention is being paid recently to the problems with opioid medications, most prominent among those being fatal overdose. In BC, where our lab is located, just last year we saw almost 1,000 deaths from opioid overdoses. And that's compared to about under 300 deaths from traffic accidents. So if you want to put it in perspective, we can see that there's a tremendous cost to opioid use. Interestingly, when we talk about cannabis as a potential substitute for opioids and for non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, just last year, this came out in 2016, we see that the combination of those two, and many people who suffer with chronic pain also suffer with depression and anxiety, so it's not unusual to be using an opioid together, a benzodiazepine together with an opioid, and that dramatically increases the risk of overdose. So to the extent that cannabis can replace both of those substances, it could have quite substantial public health benefits. And so when you look at this, you may think, well, are people using cannabis as a substitute? And some recent studies from our lab show that indeed they are. People are using cannabis as a substitute for alcohol, for recreational drugs, but also prominently for opioid medications. And that seems to be on the rise as people are becoming more and more aware of the negative effects of opioid medications. And yeah, so the top study there just came out a couple weeks ago, and it got into some detail about how people are using cannabis as a substitute. So the first study that we did showed broadly that people use cannabis as a substitute for prescription medications, particularly in pain conditions. We see almost 90% of medical cannabis users using it as a substitute for prescription medications, over half as a substitute for alcohol, and about a third as a substitute for illicit drugs. And this is important when we evaluate the public health consequences of cannabis medicines, because if people are just stacking cannabis on top of existing medications, then we may not expect to see as substantial public health gains as we would see if people are using it as a substitute. And what we see is they are in fact using it as a substitute, and the reasons for substituting are more acceptable side effects. Euphoria being one of the most prominent side effects of cannabis use, and that's not a bad thing. Ironically, that can be interpreted as risk of abuse. If you have bad side effects from a medication, you're supposed to buck up and deal. If the side effects are positive, then you have to be careful because you might start abusing it. At least that's seems to be the attitude of the medical establishment. Also, better symptom management straight up, so it's not just that it's more pleasant, it's that it works better and less withdrawal. And we think that comes directly from people who are substituting cannabis for opioids and benzodiazepines. Our more recent study got a little more granular, and we looked at specific conditions and what they were substituting for. And you can see indeed that people who are using cannabis to address pain, nearly half are using it to substitute for opioid pain medications. People who are using cannabis for mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. We see about a third substituting benzodiazepines, others substituting them for SSRIs or common antidepressants. The reasons, again, less adverse side effects being the number one, better symptom management, and less withdrawal. So the same reasons across the board. Also want to present some research that has not been published yet. This is a partnership that we undertook with the Arthritis Consumer Experts and Arthritis Research Centre of Canada, also funded by the Institute for Healthy Living. And this looked at people who are using both cannabis and either non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and opioids, and asking them to compare the relative effectiveness. And what they reported was that cannabis was equally effective when it came to directly reducing pain. Sorry, I should say these are all individuals with arthritis. So when it came to directly reducing pain, cannabis was reported to be equally effective, but more effective in some of the more psychological aspects of chronic pain, including making the pain more bearable, less irritating, and allowing them to live a normal life despite the pain. And when it came to being less depressed about the pain, cannabis reportedly performed better than both non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and opioids. This study, one of the potential limitations of the previous studies is we were directly recruiting medical cannabis users. So these are people who've already tried medical cannabis and found it to be effective. In this study, we looked at arthritis patients across the board, and a number of them were not using cannabis. We asked them why. The number one reason was potential lung damage. That makes sense given what we know about cigarette smoking, but of course there's options for edibles and vaporization that are becoming increasingly prominent that don't involve lung irritation. And of course the best research on cannabis and lung damage don't suggest that it's anywhere near as damaging as tobacco. People are also concerned about being discriminated against, which is of course unreasonable, and drowsiness is fair enough. So, when we look at the bigger picture, what does this mean for public health? And we have a really nice situation in the States where we can sort of have an experiment in nature, where we can see some states that have allowed medical cannabis and others that haven't. So we can directly compare those states. And this is a really big article in the medical cannabis community that came out a couple of years ago. And what it found was that in states that had medical cannabis laws, a 25% reduction in opioid overdose mortalities. 25% reduction. We think we lost almost 1,000 people in BC alone last year. I don't know what the statistics are for across the country, but that's a substantial mortality that could be reduced, and may in fact be reduced. We might be seeing more opioid overdoses if it weren't for the prominence of medical cannabis in BC and elsewhere. Cannabis can be a substitute not only for medical use, but also recreationally. I don't want to scandalize anyone. But looking at our students at UBC, where we have pretty high rates of cannabis use, we asked students who use both cannabis and alcohol to see if cannabis exacerbated their alcohol use. Again, if it's stacked on top of it, if it's a substance like cocaine that can promote alcohol use, that might limit the public health benefits. That's not what we find. And of course, at UBC, as in most campuses, most problems that take place on campus are alcohol related. So very few people just throw their computer through the window without some alcohol. And what we found, these are the jokes. What we found was that when using cannabis, people reported not drinking as quickly or as much. No one found that cannabis increased their alcohol cravings, and a substantial number reported that it inhibited those cravings. So that should be coming out soon. Again, some more research that's in preparation, but we're already seeing some of those effects. So a few years ago, they did a similar examination of medical cannabis versus non-medical cannabis states, and found a 10% decrease, roughly a 10% decrease in traffic fatalities in medical cannabis states. So it looks like people are substituting cannabis for alcohol to the benefit of public health. More recently, just last month, another study came out looking at a similar question. Even more conclusively showed that particularly in the age groups who were likely to use cannabis, that's 25 to 44, years of age, there was something like a 25% reduction in traffic fatalities in medical cannabis states. So substantial public health benefits there as well. This is a very convincing study. Again, just came out last year, so we're starting to learn so much. There's been such so many obstacles to conducting research on medical cannabis that we're just starting to learn so much. I think over the next decade or so, we'll learn a whole lot more. What this showed was that the use of prescription drugs fell significantly in states that had medical cannabis regulations. And these reductions were for prescription medications that cannabis would be a substitute for, so pain medications and sleep aids primarily. And the reduction was substantial when it came to Medicare Part D refers to prescription drug reimbursements. And they estimated that it was well over $150 million per year in savings. And that's probably a lowball estimate. But what about the kids, right? We always have to worry about the kids, and of course cannabis has a reputation for leading to madness. So we did a recent review, this again came out earlier this year from our group, that is the most comprehensive review to date of medical cannabis and mental health. Particularly proud of this because it's one of the few studies that's been covered in both High Times and Time magazine. So the real Time magazine and the Time as well. And we did a comprehensive review of everything that's been published on medical cannabis from 1960 to 2015, and we also looked at reviews of non-medical cannabis use. There's limited generalizability for non-medical cannabis use to medical cannabis use. There's questions about quality and consistency of non-medical cannabis. Again, I'm amazed that we don't see more health problems given the questionable conditions in which non-medical cannabis is produced. I'm surprised we don't see more problems associated with molds and pesticides, etc. But we really don't. So because there's been so much research focused almost exclusively on harms when it comes to non-medical cannabis use, in fact, it's explicitly the funding mechanisms have explicitly focused on harms. It's hard to get funded to look at anything else for cannabis. But so we looked at the reviews because to look at all the articles would be impossible. So we looked at the reviews of non-medical cannabis and mental health, and we looked at every study of medical cannabis use and mental health. Total of about 24,000.
24,000 people? That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a lot.
From 1960 to now, you can't even base anything on that.
Well,
it's nothing number.
And you know, most of it has been in the last couple of years.
That's even worse.
Yeah. So what did we find? We looked at it condition by condition, based on the categories and based broadly on the categories in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the Psychiatrist's Bible. And for anxiety disorders, there's 8 cross-sectional studies of medical cannabis. 8 of them reported relief of anxiety as a primary or secondary benefit of using medical cannabis, and 1 reported that the anxiety resumed after the cessation of cannabis use, which suggests that it is in fact the cannabis that is reducing the anxiety. The 2 reviews of non-medical use found small positive associations with higher anxiety in cannabis users, but because of the design of those studies, it's hard to say if it's just that people who are more anxious are more likely to use cannabis or whether the cannabis is causing the anxiety. The reviews concluded that there was no causal relationship between increased anxiety and cannabis use. See a similar pattern for depression. Most people who use cannabis medically reported notable mood improvements with their cannabis use. One study found that more severely depressed individuals had a higher likelihood of engaging in problematic cannabis use. Again, the construct of problematic cannabis use is a little questionable in itself, given the emphasis on frequency of use, which characterizes medical use. So people who use medical cannabis use it just about every day. Using cannabis every day is considered to be a symptom of problematic use. So there's a bit of a tautology there. Nonetheless, depression associated with problematic cannabis use. In our non-medical reviews, we see a similar pattern as what we saw for anxiety. Small positive association, but no causation. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that is gained a lot of attention in the medical cannabis world. There's 4 studies of medical cannabis use for PTSD, and the results of those have been very promising. Substantial portion of individuals with PTSD use cannabis to treat their symptoms, largely to good effect. There's self-reported good outcomes across the board, and in some trials of cannabis derivative medications, showed improving sleep and reduced nightmares. And we'll get to PTSD in a little bit more detail when we talk about what's coming next in the research. Psychotic disorders and schizophrenia are one area where cannabis use is probably counterindicated. There's some evidence of some association between cannabis use and earlier onset of psychosis. Now, there's no evidence that cannabis causes psychotic disorders in and of itself. Since the 1960s, we've seen just a huge increase in cannabis use with no concurrent increase in rates of schizophrenia. So we'd expect to see those increases. But rates of schizophrenia have remained stable, even though we've seen, drastic increases in cannabis use. So we don't think it's causal, but it could lead to an earlier break, which is a bad thing. However, there are a lot of people with psychotic disorders who use cannabis to manage their symptoms, and we can, it would suggest that they're at least experiencing some relief or perceiving it. And it may be, even though we see some temporal relationship where cannabis use comes first, it could be that the prodromal symptoms, so the early symptoms of schizophrenia, people may try to use cannabis to address those. But this is one area where further research is required, but it looks like there may be some risk. Probably the greatest health risk associated with cannabis use is onset of schizophrenia in those who have high genetic vulnerability. Neurocognition, so the rap on cannabis has been that it makes you stupid and lazy and ruins your memory. Again, the research on this is pretty inconclusive despite tremendous efforts by the National Institute of Drug Abuse to find that relationship. There's no convincing evidence of that. The one study of neurocognition in therapeutic users of cannabis found actually mild increases in neurocognitive function at 1-year follow-up, probably related to decrease in pain symptoms. When we look at the reviews from non-medical use, there's mixed findings. There's certainly some short-term memory deficits, but the best research all suggests that those resolve after a month or 2 of abstinence. And these deficits seem to be much less pronounced in regular users of cannabis. If they take naive users of cannabis, administer cannabis, and give them a bunch of tests, those people will be confused and not perform well in the test. There's also questions of effort. So if you bring someone to the lab and get them stoned and make them do a bunch of tests, they may just walk out.
So Zach, should one draw the inference that if you're a high school student or a university student and you're regularly using cannabis recreationally, that your memory and your attention will go down?
Never.
Well, there may be some acute effects. I think it depends on how the cannabis is used. If it's used right preceding studying, it may not be effective. If you are using it to study, you should use it when you write the test as well, because there's state-dependent learning, which suggests that if you learn something while you're stoned, you'll remember it better when you're stoned as well.
That's actually true. We always said that in undergrad.
No, you're 100% right. Yeah, that's what I tell my students. But there's probably some deficits in short-term memory, probably not recommended. But again, the research is equivocal on that, and that's despite substantial efforts to find a connection. One thing is that if we have adolescents who are engaging in illegal activity on a daily basis, they may have differences that are not directly related to cannabis use that might underlie the observed difference in their scholastic performance.
What if you combine the cannabis, what if a student were to combine the cannabis use, recreational cannabis use with Ritalin? What happens then? I presume this is common.
I don't know if there's we're seeing some increasing reports of people using cannabis for ADHD. There's certainly anecdotal evidence, but there isn't solid research on how those combine and what the effects are. it's definitely something that we want to look into. We actually have some research in our lab looking at it in the university students and how cannabis interacts with ADHD. Because there's so many people reporting that it helps them concentrate, but not good evidence. So the last thing that we're interested in as again, I'm a clinical psychologist, so we're interested in psychopathology, but also in harm to self or others. Of course, the reefer madness, the underlying thesis is that cannabis causes violence. There's no good evidence for that. The research, again, is equivocal. We have some research that we're just finishing up that suggests that it may reduce domestic violence. But the reviews in general, there's nothing on non-medical use. But there's nothing on medical use. The reviews of non-medical use suggest that there's no relationship between cannabis use and violence. And again, because cannabis is illegal, there's all kinds of factors associated with the illicit market that could lead to increased violence, even the small associations that we might see. And when it comes to harm to self, there's no evidence that cannabis is associated with self-injury or suicide. So that's what our review found. And one thing you might notice from the review is that this is largely cross-sectional research. And you might ask, why are there no clinical trials? Well, there's been tremendous barriers to accessing cannabis for clinical trials. Simply getting cannabis to administer has been virtually impossible for the last 50 years. We're seeing a change in that in the last 5 or 4 years since the licensed producers came to Canada. There's actually people who are producing high-quality cannabis that will be recognized by Health Canada as something that can be used in a clinical trial. That's new. Until then, all the cannabis for research purposes in North America was grown with disdain in a single lab in Mississippi. If any of you have seen cannabis, you wouldn't recognize this stuff. It looks like green talcum powder. And that's all the research that we've had on cannabis all the clinical research has been using that horrible cannabis. And it's rolled in big fat gram joints, about 4% THC. So any cannabis connoisseurs out there, and I think there may be a few of you, can imagine what it's like to gag back a fatty of NIDA weed. It's nothing like what we're used to here. So popular science noted this a few years ago. Just a couple months ago, the New York Times came out with an op-ed asking the government to allow cannabis research, especially since there's millions and millions of Americans who have access to cannabis, but no research to back it up. And a lot of doctors are constantly calling for more research, but that has still not led to a reduction in the substantial barriers. It's changing a little bit. Just about 3 months ago, our lab was the first to administer cannabis, good cannabis, for a psychiatric condition at UBC in Kelowna, and we're running in parallel to a study funded by Colorado but being run out of Johns Hopkins, and we're working side by side with them, and they're encountering their own obstacles, including the crummy NIDA weed, which they still can't seem to get right. So we're a little bit ahead of them in that trial, but hopefully over the next decade or so we should see more clinical trials and more conclusive answers about the therapeutic potential of cannabis using gold standard clinical trials that everybody wants to see. So in conclusion, we do need more research. We need clinical trials. What I'd really like to see is side-by-side trials examine the comparative effectiveness of cannabis to benzodiazepine and opioids, so people can really make informed choices about their health and knowing what is more likely to be effective. From what we have is primarily cross-sectional report from medical users, and those suggest a great amount of potential for the treatment of addictive disorders, trauma, anxiety, and depression, widespread disorders that have afflict a lot of Canadians. The safety profile is certainly acceptable. So when we do the risk-benefits, we can see there's a lot of potential benefits, few risks. And the epidemiological data that's emerged over the last 5 to 10 years suggests that there's a huge public health potential. So it's really turning out better than I think anyone expected. And That's it. Thank you. You can find out more about our work at the website or email me or get in touch. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, guys. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm glad that you guys all came out.